This is the Comics Alternative, on location at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative on location. I'm Derek.
And I'm Michael. And we are two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And we're here for the first of 2 July visits to Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. They're located at 417 Pecan Avenue in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you're in the area, be sure to stop by. It's a great shop. You really can't go wrong. The people here know their stuff, and they have a lot to choose from. That's Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. And again, we thank them for letting us come in and occupy some space in their shop.
Even on a holiday on
That's
July
right.
4th with special hours.
That's right. So Mike and I are here on July 4th. We're usually in the shop at 6 o'clock in the evenings, but Heroes is closing at 6 today because of the holiday. So we're in here a little early. Now, the second show, I think, Mike, we decided on the 18th.
That's correct.
Of July?
July
Okay.
18th, yeah.
Yes, and we, as we mentioned last time, have a new format and a new routine where we will do 2 shows on location at Heroes a month, and I'm not doing it by myself anymore. Mike is co-hosting these shows with me, and in fact, Mike, I have for you your official Comics Alternative t-shirt.
All right, this makes me an official member of the team.
That's right. Well, you were last time, but now it is
Now I have the
solidified.
costume to match.
Exactly. And, you know, since we're talking about comics, costumes are very important.
Exactly
And you
right.
said large, right?
I did indeed.
Yeah. Okay. So there you go. And in fact, if our listeners out there would like to find out about the Comics Alternative t-shirt, get in touch. We have those as a reward level on our Patreon campaign, but, you know, we'll also sell them. If you are interested, let me know. We have a couple of different, actually about 3 different styles. We have the full color with our logo, and then we have the black and white with our logo, and then we have a very limited number of the Craig Yo illustrated Comics Alternative t-shirt, which is great. I have one of those as well. So
All right, yeah.
So we
Higher
are,
level of patronage for that one, perhaps.
yes.
Wait a minute, how did this turn into a National Public Radio donation campaign?
That's right. We don't have handbags though, or totes, I guess. So
Not yet.
not yet, but you never know. You need something to carry your comics around. For those who may not have caught the last on location show, we had mentioned that with the new format, in essence, what we would do, and this is kind of loose, we'll veer from this at times, as we did last time. Mike will cover more of the more mainstream issues, and so he may talk about what's going on in the mainstream currently. He could point out 1, 2, maybe 3 titles that were released the previous 1 or 2 weeks. I, on the other hand, will primarily focus on indie, alt, small press comics. But both of us can just talk about whatever. But since Mike is much more familiar with the mainstream world than I am, I'm more into the alt stuff. So we think we have our bases covered.
I think so. Yeah, we're PhDs. We can talk about anything.
That's right.
We can't guarantee accuracy, but we can talk about it.
Exactly. Yeah, whether we feel comfortable or knowledgeable or not. So now, Mike, you were telling me before we started recording that you wanted to talk today about the classic Coke approach to the mainstream.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that I want to focus on today are the sort of the newest iterations of Justice League and Avengers. Mm-hmm. And then if there's time, maybe lead back to Tom King's Batman series, because I understand something pretty important just happened this week. I guess it was released last night. The staff here at the store are still soldiering onward, even though they had a midnight release party last night. So I want to try to get to that as well. But I've been thinking a lot in preparation for this segment and preparation for the show this summer about summer itself, as I mentioned last time, as a season of kind of reboots and restarts and revisions of characters. It seems to be, just as with Hollywood films, a major time for new releases. And so as I think about mainstream comics, I find myself thinking a lot and now the academic is going to take over for just a moment, or maybe more than a moment, about the kind of commercial and narrative strategies that DC and Marvel use with iconic and often very, very old characters. We're talking 80 years of history or more. So one of the things that fascinates me as a reader of comics, and now increasingly as a scholar focused on them, is that tension between kind of the continued viability and success of characters who are commercial properties and the creativity and ambition of the writers and artists. I think as comics have changed, particularly since the 1980s, great era of Alan Moore on Swamp Thing, Frank Miller on Batman, Howard Chaykin, as we were talking about recently, on American Flag, also helping to sort of revitalize the medium in the 1980s, there's a possibility that I think exists of sort of genuine creative and artistic ambition, even in superhero comics. And that possibility, I think, sometimes exists in a kind of tension with commercial necessities of the form, particularly as superheroes have become so popular as a genre in American life, simply an international culture for that matter, the source of huge movies earning billions of dollars. And so I think that makes for an interesting time in mainstream comics. And as test cases, what I want to focus on for just a moment are the new versions of the Justice League and the Avengers. Last week I focused a little bit more on DC. I'm still going to do that this week, but we're going to get some Marvel in. And so to go back to that notion of classic Coke, I think both of these series and so much else that's being released now are examples of what I sort of jokingly call the classic Coke formula of superhero comics. You didn't like the new Coke with the black female Iron Man and the angry, angsty Superman? Classic Coke is back for you. We're putting the red tights back on Superman. And so I think these two new versions of very established and very influential teams are pretty interesting examples of this. Both the new versions of Justice League, as written by Scott Snyder and illustrated by various artists, and the new version of Avengers, as written by Jason Aaron and illustrated by various artists, bring back together some of the most iconic characters associated with both series in familiar combinations. Interestingly enough, and we're about 3 or 4 issues into each series now, a new issue of each was just released today. Both storylines at the moment involve giant alien forces crashing to Earth, a great and familiar trope. Stay inside, perhaps on the 4th of July, or perhaps not. And both series feel as if they've been shaped to align roughly with the cinematic incarnations of the characters. So Avengers, for instance, now includes Doctor Strange and Black Panther and Captain Marvel, whose movie will be coming out in the next year or so. Justice League has a storyline featuring the Legion of Doom, and if you're following the rumors about DC's attempt to create its own cinematic universe, an interesting concept in and of itself, you know that one of the things they're thinking about is organizing the continuity of this series around the Legion of Doom. And if you actually saw Justice League, the Zack Snyder sort of, Joss Whedon sort of version of Justice League, and you stayed through the whole thing to the bitter end, I won't comment any more on that word bitter. It's an interesting, flawed movie. You know that the sort of little teaser scene at the end of the movie previewed a Legion of Doom. So I think both of these series are great examples of the sort of current tension and current opportunities that come from the way the comics publishing is more or less aligning with the film adaptations. So with the new series, I think both of them are equally entertaining, and at least for me as a reader who's perhaps jaded after more decades than I'll confess of reading these comics, they're kind of frustrating experiences too. Both, of course, feature the work of I think, pretty good writers, Scott Snyder and Jason Aaron. But for me, as I read these series with the giant alien objects crashing to Earth, both series to me suffer from a couple of the same problems. There's a lot, particularly in Scott Snyder's Justice League, of very laborious exposition to explain how the dark universe, the dark multiverse underlies the multiverse of 52 universes, which may be more than 52, and the source wall is cracked and alien forces are emerging. And honestly, I can't keep all of that straight. And it seems to be a setup for it is a setup for extended epic action sequences with lots of characters. And after a while, I think that gets kind of repetitious. It's hard to feel emotionally engaged reading those types of stories. They're entertaining, and maybe I'm even in some ways suggesting other reasons for reading comics besides entertainment, to look for something that is emotionally engaging. I'm not sure that's what all readers are looking for in superhero comics. But I think some of the problem with the spectacle, the exposition, the sheer number of characters is it becomes busy for the sake of being busy. Of the two series, I think I like Justice League so far. A little bit more. I find it a more interesting series. That's partially because what Scott Snyder is clearly doing in this, in taking the particular combinations of characters, is really evoking the animated series that was produced by Bruce Timm back end of the 20th century, maybe beginning of the 21st century. This one, that is. And that particular animated series strikes me as one of the best adaptations to another medium of superhero comics. So I enjoy the way that the current incarnation of Justice League uses a lot of those same characters. We have John Stewart, the African-American Green Lantern. We have Hawk Woman. I think she's Hawk Woman and not Hawk Girl. Hard to keep that straight. And it's clearly meant to evoke that. I think Scott Snyder also seems to be trying to tap into his inner Grant Morrison with a sort of cosmic craziness that includes, at least in the issue number 3, which came out a couple of weeks ago, a Fantastic Voyage type of mission inside the bodies of Superman and Martian Manhunter. Frankly, I think anytime you can say the phrase Martian Manhunter, that's a pretty good thing.
Yeah.
But Scott Snyder doesn't quite have Grant Morrison's sort of mad poetry, and he loves exposition, and there's a lot of exposition in that. He is unafraid of what the TV writer and producer David Simon once called the exposition dump, and that tends to make, to my mind, for an uneven reading experience. Avengers is breezier, it reads faster, but at least as of now, it's a little bit more forgettable too. Although Jason Aaron, who I think is a really talented writer, as he's shown in Thor, he is capable of writing powerful and emotionally engaging superhero narratives. And Zig and I last week were talking a little bit, last show that is, we're talking a little bit about Jason Aaron's Thor, and that deserves more attention, which we'll get to a little bit later on.
Yeah.
Should I pause for a breath?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
PhD disease. Pedantic man strikes again.
A couple things that I wanted to ask you, Mike, given all that you just said. Now, you mentioned Jason Aaron at Marvel and then Scott Snyder at DC.
Right.
It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, again, someone who is not as, at least in the contemporary sense, as well versed in the mainstream as I am in, let's say, the alternative or indie releases. Do you think that, at least at Marvel, Jason Aaron is the top writer, and then Scott Snyder, perhaps along with Tom King, the top writer or the writers at DC? So are both publishers using their, if we want to call them the best of the best,
yeah,
on
their
these
marquee
teams?
Books in some ways.
Right.
Yeah, I, that seems to be the strategy. I don't have a broad enough grasp of everything that's being published now because there is so damn much.
Especially when things ship like, 2 or 3 times a month, it seems.
Yeah. To be able to say that Jason Aaron is the top writer at Marvel, but I think clearly, as he has been positioned to take over Avengers, he's playing a very important role in the company now.
Right, and maybe more so now that Brian Michael Bendis has absconded over to
Absolutely,
to DC.
Sure.
The other
to
thing
reboot our most iconic character yet again.
Exactly, yeah. Which has me curious, and so I do find myself, or see myself in the very near future, reading more DC mainstream. And if I do read mainstream, I mean, I like Marvel well enough, but I just have more of a history with DC than Marvel. The other thing that I was thinking about when you were going over what's going on with the Justice League and with the Avengers, I'm drawn more to the Justice League, again, DC, than the Avengers, and for this reason. And tell me if I'm off base. You were talking about more heroes becoming a part of the Justice League. That may be so, but for the most part, at least historically speaking, in the times that I've read the Justice League, the team has been relatively contained.
Right.
And I appreciate that. The thing about the Avengers that has bugged me, I mean, I don't completely dislike it, but the fact that anybody and everybody can be a member of the Avengers at any particular time, and sometimes all at one time.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. The shape of that team morphs a lot more, though I think it is, and this is one of the key characteristics of Jason Aaron's run. One of the things that makes it classic Coke is that it is organized around reuniting Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor as the locus of the team.
Okay. That's the way I've always seen it.
Right, absolutely. But I think one of the charms and maybe one of the frustrations of 70 years or so of Avengers is the way that the roster of the team has changed so much. That frustrated me as a kid. I've become more accepting of that as adulthood. So maybe that's one of the advantages of growing old, is we accept those changes a little better.
Yeah. And you mentioned Grant Morrison earlier. One of my favorite runs of the Justice League is, I don't know, about like 15 years ago, perhaps.
Right, absolutely,
when he and, who was the artist that
Howard
he worked
Porter
with?
was the artist
that's
initially.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really did love that run.
Yeah, that's a terrific run. And that's also an interesting example of, to go way back in time a little bit here, of the creative ambitions of the writers and the artists running right up against the sort of larger strategy of the company. Because as I look back at that run, which I think is terrific, one of the things that always bugs me about that is that for the first 15 issues or so, Superman, after he'd come back to life for the first or second time, had a mullet. So I'm sure, in terms of Grant Morrison was going for something classic there, but it's Superman with a mullet. It was the Kyle Rayner Green Lantern. I'm really embarrassed at the level of detail I can bring to this. And then about 15 issues in, there was another storyline running through the Superman titles when he became the sort of blue-skinned electric Superman.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine how frustrated Grant Morrison must have been having to deal with those changes mandated by the company, to sort of branch off to another superhero epic that I think is one of the most interesting examples in the genre. Jonathan Hickman's long, massively ambitious run on Avengers, which features that entire array of characters that Derek, you found a little bit frustrating. But at the end of that run, what was it, in Captain America's title, he had been aged and he lost his youth, and clearly the stories that Hickman was writing were designed for the classic version of the character, and he had to adapt to the corporate strategy because of a storyline going on in another title. And I think those are some of the complications of mainstream comics. Yeah,
well, one of the things you're saying now is the ways in which individual artistic, whether it be writer or what have you, ambitions have to butt heads with corporate demands.
Absolutely, yeah.
So if, a Superman has to have a mullet, that becomes problematic. And by the way, mullet Superman is my least favorite. I'll take any other Superman outside of mullet Superman.
Even the blue electric Superman?
Yes.
Really? Wow, that's
just because of the mullet, I have to say.
For me, it's the blue electric Superman. I can't go there. That's...
Yeah. And, I remember reading the whole Death of Superman
I'm shocked to remember
saga.
the blue electric Superman, for that matter.
And then the almost the chaos it felt to me was going on with Superman after the death.
Yeah.
And again, that's corporate mandated storytelling and not my favorite.
And that's also, I think, just speaking historically, one of the perhaps the first examples, not necessarily the very first, but one of the first examples, and certainly one of the first and most successful examples of sort of the big mandated company event. Mike Carlin, who was editor at the time, talking about why they chose to do that story, simply said, well, we needed to call more attention to Superman. We needed to spike the sales. So there's always this tension between the creativity of the writers and the artists and the commercial mandates as well.
Right. And there's some events that I think are, at least for me, are successful and enjoyable.
Yeah.
And, one of those would be, one that stands out for me is Civil War at Marvel. The original, not, the more
I like
recent.
that well enough.
And then, Crisis with DC.
Right,
And so I think if it's handled well, it's fine. And I know why they do this. It's to generate sales, it's for marketing, and I understand that. I have nothing against that. And I don't think it dirties up, so to speak, comics.
I agree.
Because that's just part and parcel of the industry. And so once you accept that.
And it's part and parcel of the genre to have those massive events.
Exactly,
massive crossovers.
So that's something that you'll find in superhero narratives, but you won't find in other kinds of comics, other genres.
Yeah, I'll throw out just one more example of an event that I think is worth checking out, just from years ago, just to pick up on something I was talking about earlier, talking about Jonathan Hickman's run on Avengers, which interestingly enough comes out at the same time, shortly after the first movie, and there's an interesting tension there. But that ends with the series that he and Asad Ribic, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, forgive me, did Secret Wars, which I think is one of those stories where you have this sort of huge epic with hundreds of characters, and that ends up becoming something that is much more focused on just a handful of characters, bringing together Hickman's long run, going back through his run on Fantastic Four, and it ends up being a very personal story about Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic, and Dr. Doom, and one of the best explorations of those characters.
You mentioned Fantastic Four. Are you looking forward to the return of Fantastic Four?
I am. Obviously, the Jack Kirby Stan Lee run on Fantastic Four is one of the greatest runs in superhero comics, if not the very greatest. I have a lot of attachment to those characters. Obviously, as with any long-running characters, as creators come and go, the quality varies quite a bit. But yeah, I'm glad to see them back. The Fantastic Four, as someone who grew up in the 1960s, that is the Fantastic Four. Oh, gosh, I messed up that sentence. That's a dangling modifier. Grammar freaks out there, please don't hound me for that.
Remember, guys, we're two guys with PhDs talking about
and
comics.
We can get tangled up in all of these issues. Fantastic Four for me was always, it was the world's greatest comics magazine, as Stan Lee said. It was the sort of flagship title of the Marvel line. So I think it deserves to be back.
Yeah. And, I guess from what I understand, or word on the street, is that Marvel took it off the shelves temporarily because they didn't own the rights to at least the cinematic version of Fantastic Four. Kind of a cynical way of going about things, but also a way of generating
cynicism
interest.
In the comics industry? I'm shocked.
Yeah.
Here? Cynicism?
But I can only imagine the sales numbers of Fantastic Four when it comes back.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if those characters have legs, given that they have been not featured in comics for a while, and there have been not as a team, and there have not been successful movie adaptations. Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons also Fantastic Four was taken off the shelves, was canceled for a while, not only because Marvel did not own the film rights, that's owned by 20th Century Fox, but also because apparently of an intense hatred, I want to say, between Ike Perlmutter, who is the owner of Marvel still, I believe, and whoever owns Fox. So, corporate rivalries between billionaires. Sounds like a comic book plot.
Yeah. Something that you said a little while ago when you mentioned Grant Morrison actually kind of leads me into one of the things I wanted to mention in terms of a highlight of a recent comic, or at least the beginning of a comic series. I've always seen Grant Morrison as being almost like two creators in one, two writers in one. On the one hand, there is, I think, the Grant Morrison most people think about, and that is the wild and wacky, out there Grant Morrison. And classic examples of that would be his run on The Invisibles, and then the Doom Patrol. But there are others as well. Sea Guy is another such title. I really do love that Grant Morrison. But I also appreciate the, I guess, more staid or the saner Grant Morrison. And that's the kind of stuff that he worked on, let's say, with the Justice League. Right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So there are two kinds or two sides of Grant Morrison. Now, the creator that I want to talk about right now, or one of the creators I want to discuss, Evan Dorkin, also has two sides. And I don't know how familiar you are with Evan Dorkin's work.
A little bit.
There is the wild and wacky and anything goes Evan Dorkin, and then there is the more tempered, and I don't want to say more serious, because even his wild stuff is serious to a large degree. But again, I guess the more tame side of Evan Dorkin. Now, when it comes to the wild stuff, obviously, Milk and Cheese stands out. And I don't know if you've read any Milk and Cheese comics. One of my favorites, basically.
Long time ago.
For those who aren't familiar, a series of strips, short pieces for the most part, featuring a block of cheese and a carton of milk. Who, as the tagline goes, they're dairy products gone bad. And so they're always angry, they're always destroying things, they're always causing chaos. And I love it. And that's like Evan's way of almost breaking out, lashing out, using his comics to say anything and everything. Yeah. Along with that, I would put his series Dork, which I think later this month, I believe it is, that Dark Horse is going to come out with a really nice hardbound collection of all of his Dork strips. So we have that side of Evan Dorkin. But there's another side of Evan Dorkin that is a little more tempered, a little more serious, that you don't have the craziness and the chaos of something like Milk and Cheese or the humor of Dork. There I would put his work on Beasts of Burden that he does with Joel Thompson. And in fact, there is coming out soon going to be a new Beasts of Burden story, so I'm looking forward to that. There's also work that Evan has done with his wife, Kala Cthulhu, and I think that originally appeared on the app Stila, and then Dark Horse released a print version of that, perhaps earlier this year. I can't remember, maybe later last year, or late last year. But a new series that Evan has just come out with, I would also put in the more serious side of Evan Dorkin, and this is Blackwood. Have you read any of Blackwood?
I have not. Basically, I know Evan Dorkin's work. I believe that he did some of the work for the DC Comics adaptation of those Bruce Timm animated series.
Yes, he did that. Yeah, he did some of that.
Which, again, for me is the way that I know his work.
Yeah. Well, this is a series that has, I guess, just recently started. The first issue of Blackwood, and I think it's a 4-issue miniseries. First issue came out last month, or maybe it was even back in May. And then the second issue of Blackwood was released last Wednesday, so the very end of June. And Veronica Fish does the art for this. And the only thing that Veronica Fish has done that I'm aware of, and she's done several things, but the only thing that I'm aware of is her run on Archie with Mark Waid. Really did a good job there, and she does a good job in Blackwood. Now, Blackwood is a story of this school, and you can't help but think of Hogwarts. Right. Because this is a college that or a school, kind of like a prep school, that deals with the occult in one form or another. And in the first issue, we're introduced to Blackwood through, I guess, the arrival of 4 new students. And these are 4 young people who, I don't know, I wouldn't call them losers, but they don't have much luck in life. And they have a spotted past, although we really don't know what the pasts are with these characters yet. Even by the time we get halfway through this 4-issue series, number 2 just came out again last week, we still don't know much about these 4 characters. But they come to school and they start learning that there's something going on at this school that they weren't aware of, they weren't told about. There's a passage, and I have it here digitally, that I want to bring up. In the second issue, where we have something really weird happens to the dean of the school. He seems to be taken over by some kind of alien force or some kind of creature. We don't know exactly what's going on. He throws himself down a well, and for all practical purposes, he seems to be dead. No one knows what's going on with him. So the associate dean becomes the temporary dean, and he's talking to these 4 new students at one point, and he basically describes what Blackwood is. He says, "Now then, there are 2 schools here at Blackwood. Got that? There's the one we let everyone see, the loopy one that teaches the history of funny old beliefs and practices and what have you. Then there's the other school, hidden inside that one, and it's a secret even to many of our students, where it's all real and always has been." And so the students right now are just learning that there's something about this school that they weren't aware of. That, so far, is the description we get of Blackwood. I like this series. I'm curious where it goes. And, I love Evan Dorkin as a writer. I do have to say, though, that if this is a 4-issue miniseries, I still have a lot of questions by the end of issue number 2. And it seems to me too many questions that could be answered in the next 2 issues. And maybe I'm wrong. So when I go on to read next month, the 3rd, and then the following month, issue number 4, maybe a lot of this stuff will all be coming together. But it seems to me that as many balls as Dorkin has thrown up in the air so far, he's going to have to really bring a lot of it together, maybe perhaps too quickly in the last 2 issues.
And that seems an example of the way a lot of mainstream and at least close to mainstream comics are written and created these days, which is to say, okay, we've got a 4-issue or a 6-issue story that is being created with an eye to it being offered later as a graphic novel. The graphic novels themselves, or perhaps a sequence of miniseries, a 4-issue miniseries or 6-issue miniseries, then becomes a way of extending that storyline without perhaps the monthly grind of a regular comic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do hope that it successfully comes together and wraps up in a satisfying way, because I had a lot of expectation for this. First and foremost, because Evan Dorkin's just a great writer, and I think he has an incredible sense of humor. And in fact, I'm hoping later this month to get him back on the Comics Alternative for an interview. We interviewed him it was about exactly 2 years ago. Gene Cannonberg, one of my co-hosts for the regular show, and I talked with Evan, and I don't know if you've ever heard Evan speak at a con. I know he's been at Heroes Con a number of years. Boy, when he goes, and he can carry an entire room if it's a panel at a conference. And with our interview, I kid you not, Mike, we were recording for, if I remember correctly, over 3 hours.
Wow.
And it was so long that I felt the need to break up that interview into 2 episodes. And so we had the interview with Evan Dorkin, part 1, and then part 2, and he was just all over the place. Gene and I were basically just listening and laughing the entire time, and it was a lot of fun. And so we hope to talk with him again this month, because he has a lot going on. There's, as I mentioned, this new series. We have the first 2 issues of it now, Blackwood, and then he has the upcoming Beasts of Burden storyline, and then we have this collection of Dork. So I want to get him on to talk about that. So I'm looking forward to seeing how Blackwood wraps up, and I hope it does well. Now, another title that I wanted to discuss that is recent, and I think the first issue of this came out last week, right? So the last Wednesday in June. And this is Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer, and this is part of Titan Comics' Hard Case Crime series. Have you read anything or familiar with what Titan's doing with Hard Case Crime?
No, not at all. I've seen the cover for Mike Hammer, and it's a terrific recreation of an old paperback cover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, the Hard Case Crime series that is coming out from Titan is both comics and prose. I don't know when Titan acquired the right for the prose, but I know over the past several years they've been putting out these editions of sometimes classic, sometimes maybe not so classic crime stories that have been really good.
And does this include Mickey Spillane's original Mike Hammer?
I don't know if the original Mike Hammer stuff is coming out in the Hard Case Crime series from Titan. I'll have to check that out. But over the past, it must be 3-4 years perhaps. They've been coming out with comics that are a part of this line as well. Peepland, I think, was a title that has already wrapped up part of the Hard Case Crime series. Triggerman is another. And the most recent one is Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer. Now, this is written by, of course, Mickey Spillane, but for all practical purposes in the comics, it's Max Allan Collins who does most of the writing. And then the art is by a couple of creators I'm not familiar with, Marcelo Salza and Marcio Ferrer. It's interesting. I read the first issue. I don't know how many issues to expect, probably 4 in this series. Yeah. It's an interesting setup, and it's like typical Mike Hammer. So there's nothing, I think, out of the ordinary about it. The thing about this first issue that struck me, though, is I think it's a good first issue in that it sets up the mystery. That Hammer is being hired to protect someone at an event, and then something begins to go wrong.
Yeah. Is this an adaptation of one of Mickey Spillane's books, or is it a new story?
Yes, it has to be, because Spillane is credited as one of the writers.
Got it.
The thing about this first issue that I don't want to say bothered me, but didn't impress me as much, is the art. It just seemed to me to be a little too obviously computer generated. And maybe I'm wrong there, but it didn't really capture me in ways that maybe the story, or at least the first issue, did in terms of its storyline. Nonetheless, I'm going to continue reading on because I like what Titan has been doing lately with the Hard Case Crime series. And, it is Mike Hammer, so.
Yeah. Classic American character. And, of course, Mickey Spillane, at least very early in career, if not at the very beginning of his career, was writing those little one-page prose pieces that used to appear in Timely Comics back in the 1940s. Was that like a post office requirement that you had to have a prose piece in every issue?
Yeah, I think it was something like that in order to get a particular kind of mailing privilege. One other thing that I wanted to mention in terms of what I'm reading now in terms of non-mainstream comics, and this is something actually I've been reading for a few weeks now, and I'm about to wrap it up. And this is Urasawa's 20th Century Boys, the series. I don't know how much manga you read.
Not much at all.
Yeah. I have, over the past few years, especially since we've been doing the monthly manga series, have been reading more and more, to the point that it seems that when I'm not reading for the podcast, if I read other comics, more times than not, it's going to be manga. Because I feel, well, one, I really enjoy it, but also I feel that there's a lot more that I need to know about the world of manga. And so this is a way of educating myself. Now, I've read a number of Urasawa's other series, like Master Keaton. I've read all of that series. It's really good. Monster is outstanding. I had not yet, until, let's say, several weeks ago, read any of 20th Century Boys. I started that. The 20th Century Boys runs for 22 volumes, and then there are 2 volumes.
That's a commitment.
21st Century Boys. Whoa. So all in all, it's 24 volumes. And beginning, I think, around...
And each of those volumes is a single paperback, correct?
Yes, and so...
a couple of 100 pages each?
Yes, and VIZ Media began putting out what they call signature editions of 20th Century Boys. And there are other editions out there, but the signature editions began putting those out, I think, around 2009, maybe 2010. And for the longest time, I didn't get any of those because I was wanting VIZ to release perfect editions of 20th Century Boys. And we have perfect editions with the Master Keaton series and now with the Monster series. Okay. The perfect edition basically is 2 volumes of the signature edition in one, in these nice, slightly oversized, not too much bigger than the signature editions, I think, volumes. So I don't know if you get more for your buck. You probably do. But they're really nice volumes.
Yeah, and the larger
French
presentation with the artwork always makes a difference.
And also, yes, you get some color pages with the perfect editions. I waited for a while and then realized if a perfect edition is going to come out, it'll be a while. So last year I began getting bit by bit the various volumes of the signature editions. So I have all of them now. I'm almost finished with this series, and I'll be damned if I didn't see in this month's previews catalog, VIZ was announcing new perfect editions of 20th 20th Century Boys.
Of course.
Yes.
And you are going to snap those up, right?
No, I'm not, because I have all the signature editions. So the perfect editions are about to be released, I guess, in 2 or 3 months from now. But I'm glad that I did what I did by getting the signature editions, because if I had to wait for all of the perfect editions to come out, then it would be maybe at least a couple of years before they would all be released. So I have everything, and I'm about to wrap up everything. And it really is an incredible story. I enjoy it. Basically, it begins in the 1970s with a group of young boys, and they have this secret hiding space, which basically is... it's in this field, and they've made the grass into kind of a little hut or tent that they could get inside and hide away. And so, they have their manga there, they have a radio, they can draw, they have a notebook there that they take notes.
Every kid's fantasy to have a little secret hiding place like that.
And so you have this group of kids, and what they do is they start fantasizing about what would happen, what kind of adventure story can we create? What kind of fantasy can we create? What kind of hero story can we create? And so they come up with this story where, there's a killer virus that hits Los Angeles and then hits Japan. And then after that, there's a gigantic robot, and the gigantic robot starts to spread this kind of contagion, and people start dying from this. But then there's another robot that they create to take care of that other one. And so they come up with this elaborate and, child-inspired story. These are young boys, right? Years later, when they're adults, events begin to occur that accurately reflect this scenario that they mapped out as kids and wrote down in a book of prophecy, which is what they call it, the book of prophecy. They come to discover that there's an individual behind all of these happenings, a mysterious figure who's going by the name The Friend.
So how many volumes does it take for all of this narrative to play out that you've just described?
I think it's within the first maybe 8 to 10 volumes that this initial storyline, the things that are played out by the Book of Prophecy, it unfolds.
Sure.
But then there's more to it after that. And the thing that I really enjoy about 20th Century Boys is the way that Urasawa writes this. You think that there's going to be a particular endpoint after so many volumes. And then, that there are 24 volumes in all. Right. So I remember getting through like the first 5, 6, 7 and thinking, okay, it's about to wrap up. What are they going to do with the rest of them? My expectations were thwarted. There's other things. There are other complications that go on. And so he's really good at taking his story and giving it an additional spin, and not in a cynical or even cheesy way, but in a way that kind of enlivens the narrative. And he's done that throughout the series. And on the one hand, I'm kind of sorry that I didn't read this when it was originally being released in English. On the other, because I'm coming to it late. On the other hand, I, at my leisure, can read this series, and I am on 21st Century Boys Volume 1, so there's just one more volume after that, and I'm really enjoying that.
There's a luxury also when you have a complete storyline in print. And you can read the complete storyline as opposed to be waiting for the serial publication of the continuation of that storyline.
Right. And, that's one of the reasons, and this is a way of coming back to what you were talking about in terms of mainstream titles and events. When it comes to DC, Marvel events, what I will do if I read it, I'll just wait till everything plays out.
Yeah.
And then I have everything. So I'm not one of those who will read on a week-by-week or month-by-month basis what's going on in a particular event in the mainstream universes. I'll just wait till everything plays out.
Yeah. For me, that depends on the title and how invested I am in that title and that particular character, set of characters, and that particular set of creators as well. But there are certain storylines, certain series where I will wait for a complete accumulation of them. 12-issue segments, for instance, of Ta-Nehisi Coates' work on Black Panther is one.
Now, I know last time you had mentioned something about being really interested in what Coates not only has done in terms of Black Panther, but is about to do with Captain America. So you want to speak to that more?
Yeah, his first version of Captain America, first issue of Captain America, of his run, that is, came out just this week. So I'm very interested in what he's going to do with the character. I think the cultural politics of this are just fascinating. to have a prominent African-American writer, one of our great public intellectuals, and a longtime comics fan, take over this iconic character, in some ways more iconic than Black Panther. One would expect Ta-Nehisi Coates or someone like that to write Black Panther. But now to have him take over Captain America with all of the political and cultural issues that are kind of bound up in the long history of that character, I think is really fascinating. We go back to the origin of that character, and it's clearly with Joe Simon or Jaime Simon and Jack Kirby or Jacob Kurtzberg. Captain America is one of those original Golden Age characters created by first-generation Jewish Americans that represents a dream of assimilation and Americanization. So now to have someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates take over that character, who has written so critically and so accurately about American life and the dangers of American life, particularly for African-American men, I think that's going to be a fascinating combination. I find his work on comics to be very interesting, but a little bit of a frustrating read. The politics, the ideas, the characterization, the development of the world of Wakanda, all of which we saw adapted to the screen with the Black Panther film, are really fascinating. He seems less adept at the particular mechanics of a superhero narrative, so action sequences don't seem as integrated as well in the storyline. It's just, okay, now we need a big battle, and let the particular artist, whether it's Brian Stelfreeze or, trying to remember who else has done this, Chris Sprouse, sorry, the names are flying out of my mind now, of other artists, sort of take over for the usual kind of posturing of superhero battles. Having said that, I'm only referring to the first 12 issues of his run. I've not read after that, and that's piled up waiting for me to read as well.
Okay, so let me ask you this, because I'm not familiar with it. I've just heard people talk about it, but you are. So his run on Black Panther, and then you read the first issue of Captain America. How political?
I've not read that yet.
You
just came out today. Just got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. So okay, how political, overtly or otherwise, is Coates in his writing?
I think reasonably so. I'm not going to say overtly, but certainly in Black Panther, both in the comic, and this has been in the comic series for a while, but it's been teased more to the surface by Ta-Nehisi Coates, working on the heels of Reginald Hudlin and Christopher Priest before him. And of course, this is very much in evidence in the movie as well, is the way this sort of Afrofuturism of Black Panther speaks to the history of colonialism in Africa. So I think some of those issues are coming to the surface. The first 12 issues of Black Panther really all have to do with the idea of the monarchy, which has always been a part of the narrative background of Black Panther as a character and the fictional nation of Wakanda, created originally by Jack Kirby, how the monarchy evolves into a constitutional monarchy. So we've got those politics at work there.
Okay. And the reason I'm asking is because politics and comics lately have been on my mind, and for this reason.
Is there something going on politically these days?
I think some political stuff is going on, and the news is aware of this. But
if only a giant alien object would crash to Earth and get us out of this particular mode.
Yes, exactly. The reason that this has been on my mind is now we're recording this on a Wednesday, July 4th.
Right.
The episode that went up today, the regular review episode of the Comics Alternative, is actually our July preview show. On that recording, I highlight Pia Guerrera's, who did the art on Why the Last Man, has a book that is being solicited called Me the People, and it's a series of her cartoons about current politics, particularly the Trump administration. And when I mentioned that on the episode, I said something that I've heard, I reacted to what I've heard a few other comics podcasters say, and that is that they really don't like overt politics mixed in with their comics. I don't know. Yeah. My belief in terms of any kind of narrative, whether it be comic-based or otherwise, politics are a part of it, whether you like it or not, whether it's intended or not. Sometimes it's going to be more overt and in your face. At other times, maybe like with the Coates work, it's going to be a little more embedded and not as obvious. I have no problem with a variety of cartoonists, like Guerra or, let's say, Shannon Wheeler, who comes out with, let's say, anti-Trump comics. And also the use that certain comics creator may make of not only the Trump administration, I guess especially the Trump administration, but also other political moments that are going on. And we saw something similar, maybe with a different tone to it, a much different tone, about 8 years ago with Obama, of course. I have no problem with politics, even overt politics, being mixed in with my stories, because I don't think there's any such thing as, let's say, a pure comic. But I know that some people have a problem with this. But I just find that a fascinating issue, how there's certain readers that don't like the more overt, politically critical kind of creators, writers, and artists. And then there are others who have, like me, who have no problem with it.
Sure. I mean, I think that there is I'm not sure I want to call it a political conservatism, but sometimes an aesthetic conservatism in mainstream readers. Maybe this will get me a whole lot of angry comments. Sorry, I'll own it. I said it. And I think that resists sometimes the political overtones that occasionally creep into stories. Are superhero stories effective vehicles for political commentary? I think that's open for conversation, at least. And I think that's going to be one of the most interesting things about Ta-Nehisi Coates' run on Captain America, to see what he does with that. Given the symbolic nature of that character, there are a lot of opportunities for comments. On the other hand, how serious of a commentary is it if you want to go way back in time to the 1970s when the disguised leader of the secret empire in Steve Englehart's run on Captain America is supposed to be Richard Nixon at the end of the Watergate scandal. I don't think I don't think that had much of an effect on electoral politics in the nation at large. I could be confused about that, but I don't think that it does. On the other hand, I think when comics creators, particularly in the mainstream, there's so much more that can be done in independent comics. But in the mainstream, when creators tap into some of those issues in direct or indirect ways, rather than that functioning as an effective commentary on political issues that's actually going to change anybody's mind, it adds a kind of energy to the storylines as well.
Yeah. You mentioned the 1970s, and I was thinking about that storyline with Captain America, Englehart, that you mentioned, which is a great example. And that, I think, would be a political message that is overt and right there in your face.
Sure.
After that, there's another 70s run, and that is...
I don't know. Nixon's looking pretty good today, actually. If I could trade in our current administration for Nixon, I'm going for it.
See, that's the sad thing about the current moment is that
I take responsibility
Nixon,
for that comment,
but
too.
also Bush Jr. seems to be at least less desirable, less undesirable than they were to me before.
Yeah.
But in the 70s, we also had the Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams run on Green Lantern, Green Arrow, which is another kind of political comic in that we don't have a direct address to, let's say, a Nixonian figure, but they're definitely dealing, unmistakably so, you have to see it, with certain political issues at the time. Yeah,
they are. And yet I think if you go back and look at those comics, and honestly, I would describe them as fun.
Yeah.
They're really interesting sort of relics of the late 60s and early 1970s. But if we're looking to comics, or frankly even today to films adapted from comics, superhero films, and looking for serious political commentary in them, I think we're mistaken to look for that in those comics. Having said that, what exists then in comics form as serious, genuinely thoughtful political commentary? As I'm sitting in the store now, I'm looking across the store at an oversized edition of Jaime Hernandez's work on Love and Rockets, of the art in that. And I think if we look at Love and Rockets, a series like that in its totality, exploring lives in the Latino community, dealing with issues of gender and sexuality, that to me constitutes a fairly significant political and cultural statement although not one that's necessarily tied to electoral politics.
Right. And I'm glad that you brought that up. And by the way, I would love to be able to afford that oversized edition that Fantagraphics put out. I can't remember what they call their oversized series, but it would be great to have. And I know my new co-host for the regular weekly series, Paul Lai, has this, and so I'm very jealous of him. But I mean, that's yet again kind of another level, if we want to look at it this way, of political comics. So on the one hand, you have the in-your-face overt stuff where figures like Nixon or Trump are directly engaged and critiqued, right? Then after that, we have the message, let's say, by O'Neill and Adams, where you know that they're dealing with current political, cultural issues, unmistakably so, but they're not overtly tied to electoral politics, right?
They're not. Although there is an issue where Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, or a character who is clearly drawn to look like Spiro Agnew, has a kind of mutant child with all kinds of magical powers. I'm not quite sure how that functions as a political commentary, but if you're looking for a comic book that features Spiro Agnew, that's the one you want to find.
Yes. And that may not even be that much of a fantasy, in fact. But then on the other hand, you have at a different
level. Even Agnew's
level,
looking pretty good these days.
Yeah, but on another level, you have the example of the Hernandez brothers, where politics is obviously cultural politics and otherwise. It's definitely baked into their stories. However, they're dealing with, let's say, non-specific issues or controversies or even figures, you know, like elected officials, but are engaging in cultural politics in ways that are much more subtle but nonetheless effective.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think if we're looking at current comics to comment on what's happening now, just given the lag time between the creation of those comics and the incredible rush of public events, it's just hard to imagine how they can do that effectively. I mean, what would we think of a comic book creator a few months ago who envisioned America creating internment camps again and putting kids in cages?
Oh, God.
You know, we talk about the horrors in comics, but they're nothing compared to what we're experiencing today. Sorry again for lapsing into overtly political commentary here.
Mm-hmm. No, it's okay. It's definitely okay on this podcast. That's for certain. Now, you know, listeners of the On Location show will know that usually what we attempt to do is to bring in the comments of others, customers, or even store employees into whatever it is that we're talking about. And
nobody wants to talk to us today.
No. And we kind of knew this going in, because one of the things we do, we have, and in fact, if you want to be a part of this, just contact me on Facebook and let me know. We have, I guess, a messaging group where people who come into the shop who have talked with us before, I basically let them know, hey, we're going to be at the shop on this particular date at this time. If you're coming to pick up your comics on that Wednesday, stop by, say a few words. And we usually get 1, 2, 3, sometimes more people coming in to talk with us. But a number of people weren't going to be here today, and they send their regrets. I know, Zig, who usually sits down with us, Alphonse last time, said that they wanted to be here, but they couldn't today. And we kind of expected this being a holiday, and late in the afternoon, not many, if anybody would come in and talk to us, and that's fine. But
we're just sitting here, we're waiting, we got chairs out for you, you know, if you hear us and can come through time and join us.
Yeah. And, you know, if you're listening to this and you're in the Charlotte area, we're here on Wednesdays, and we will we'll always let the shop know ahead of time when we're going to be there. They usually put up some kind of announcement, an event on their Facebook page, on the Heroes Facebook page, to announce it. And then we send out word as well. True. So definitely come by the shop if you're in the area and talk with us, because we do like to engage with customers and see what they're reading. And also, it's less talking for us, which is good for the listener, I guess.
It probably is, yes. Yeah.
So, Mike, let me ask you, are there any upcoming comics that are going to be released, maybe, today that you haven't read yet, or in the weeks to come that you're particularly looking forward to? Well,
I've already mentioned the Ta-Nehisi Coates Captain America, but of course, what's the big issue this week, which is currently sold out at Heroes, is Batman number 50, featuring the wedding of Batman and Catwoman. And I've talked before, and will doubtless continue to do so, about how interested I am in the writing of Tom King. Preparing for today's show, I went back through some of the early issues of his run in Batman, and I think that this is will prove itself to be a classic run. Tom King, as I've suggested before, is occupying something like the position Alan Moore occupied in mainstream comics in the 1980s. And I think as an adventurous, inventive, just genuinely talented writer at every level, Tom King is pretty close to that stature. So I'm excited to read what happens in this issue. We're, of course, playing with two of the most iconic characters in the history of the form, dealing with an erotic and romantic tension that has been there since, I guess, Catwoman appeared in Batman #1 in, I want to say, 1940. King's level of characterization, I think, is just terrific. The characterization and plotting. Derek, you read a little passage from a comic before, so I'm going to actually do the same myself. This is from number 10 of his Batman run. Shortly after he began the long set of plot threads that are leading to the marriage of Batman and Catwoman today. The architecture of this whole run is, as I look back on it, and as I will continue to follow it, I think is really fascinating. And it's clearly planned out far in advance. But I think I talked before about some of the problems with mainstream comics where you get spectacle and great action sequences and your favorite heroes together in one adventure. But at least for someone like myself who's been reading comics way longer than anybody should, perhaps, having difficulty finding that to be emotionally engaging anymore. And I think what Tom King has done with the characters of both Batman and Catwoman is to present those characters as essentially two wounded children. Wounded children reliving those wounds in these, wildly symbolic, over-the-top ways of these characters in costumes. So here's a passage from issue number 10 of King's run on Batman, which I think gets to the core ideas of what he wants to do with these characters. I should mention that the way these captions are presented, the lettering is done in a script that is reflecting a letter, perhaps a journal, that Catwoman is writing to Batman. Much of the same way that Alan Moore often did, the captions themselves are superimposed over a narrative sequence where something very different is happening. In this case, Batman is attempting to break out of a trap in which he's been sealed in a dungeon with water rising beneath him, and he's trying to break out of that. In contrast to that, and I think the tension actually between these two things works really well, we have this ongoing narrative throughout the issue of Catwoman as a first-person narrator in the letter that she's writing, commenting on their relationship. And so I think this is a fascinating insight into this. Here's where it begins. We're alike in so many ways, you and I. The cat and the bat. Broken orphans dressed as animals, jumping from the rooftops. It's why, in some ways, we work. Why we work together, I mean. Why when we kiss, the pain goes away. You feel that too, right? How just for a second, just that second, the pain is gone. I think that's just terrifically paced writing. I think it gets as deeply as one can into the psyches and the emotions of characters who are as exaggerated and over the top in so many ways as Batman and Catwoman. And in fact, it also gets to another sort of highlight of the way that he's treating the relationship between these characters, which is the erotic passion between them. You're dressed in tight-fitting outfits modeled after animals, and you're jumping around, participating in absolutely violent displays of physical expression. There's something else going on there besides stopping that bank robbery.
Right.
And I think Tom King taps into that really well. It's a fascinating series. Again, sort of fascinating architecture of that series to go back and see the way it's been put together. I'd also highlight, the wedding issue today is a major release. The two issues preceding it are really interesting issues. A two-part story fitting into the larger narrative called The Best Man, which sees the Joker reacting to not being invited to the wedding. And the second part of that is essentially a long conversation interspersed over many hours between the Joker and Batwoman after the Joker and Catwoman, that is, not Batwoman yet. After the Joker has shot Catwoman and she's lying on the floor trying not to bleed out, and she has clawed his neck, and he's lying on the floor trying not to bleed out. The dialogue, the structure of that recalls, here it is again, Alan Moore, particularly Alan Moore and Brian Boland's The Killing Joke, right. And there are some overt references to that as well.
That's interesting. Now, late last week, I got because I'm on their media mailing list, a digital copy of both this issue of Batman where they get married.
No spoilers now.
No. Well, okay.
No spoilers.
No, but listen to what because I'm going to say I got that copy and I got Catwoman number 1. I was hoping to be able to read them by today. I didn't find the time to read them, unfortunately. I would have felt, though, at a loss because I have not been keeping up with Tom King's Batman. And so I was wondering, if I read these, how much will I get out of it? Now, you haven't read the marriage issue yet.
Right, yeah.
But do you think that given the few issues that lead up to that, and then Catwoman number 1, I mean, is this something that I could, or any reader could, jump on board at around the time of this wedding, reading this latest issue of Batman and then Catwoman number 1?
I suspect you could. I think the rewards are much greater if you're following the whole narrative. And that, to me, is one of the most fascinating things about mainstream comics today, which is that tension between creating sometimes, occasionally, self-satisfying individual stories, but also the richness that comes as writers take advantage of the possibilities of long narrative arcs that stretch over years. And I think when we find writers who are willing, and I keep emphasizing writers, in many ways mainstream comics are a writer-driven medium. I'm not sure about that, but I'm going to throw that out there as an idea. But when we find writers who are able to take advantage of the possibilities of these huge narrative structures that go on for years, and I'm thinking of Tom King with his work on Batman, Jonathan Hickman with his work on Avengers and Fantastic Four, and how all of that rolled together, and Jason Aaron with the storyline that he's been essentially telling with Thor over 3-4 years now, that becomes a really interesting and, to my mind, a rewarding narrative form if we have the patience to put up with the serial publication of that.
Okay. Now, I was asking you what you're looking forward to,
right.
And one of the things I'm looking forward to, I think it was released last month. I just have not received my copy yet. It's on order. I hope to get it soon. And that is this really massive, oversized edition that Dark Horse Comics is, or I guess now has put out, A Contract with God Curator's Edition. Yeah. And it's not often that I will get these large, oversized, let's say, artist editions, which is what IDW calls it. But I think I've told you before, the only 2 artist editions I have from IDW are the 2 Spirit ones.
Right, yeah.
And, being a big fan and also a scholar of Will Eisner, I have those, and I just felt that I needed to get this curator's edition from Dark Horse that Dennis Kitchen is not only contributing to, but overseeing.
And Dennis Kitchen oversees the Will Eisner estate, or at least the publications of the Will Eisner estate.
Exactly.
Right?
And so I am really looking forward to getting my hands on that. Now, a few months ago, I did get an early digital version of that in PDF format, which tells me what's going to be in it, but it's not the exact same thing as for a text like that as the physical copy where I can hold it and I can see the original artwork. And then there are the essays that are in it as well. So I am really looking forward to that. I've done quite a bit of work with A Contract with God, so it holds a special place in my heart. But just Will Eisner as a whole. Right, I mean, I love his work. Sure. I've done a bit of writing on his, maybe not the spirit stuff, but let's say his, if you want to call it the graphic novel work that he in many ways is known for. So I'm looking forward to this curator's edition.
Yeah, I think the curator's editions, the artist editions that IDW publishes, and there are versions of those things published by Dark Horse, and as I look across the room at the Love and Rockets volume, by Fantagraphics as well. Those are just, we were talking about this on our last show together, those are just beautiful, beautiful productions. And I think particularly for older art, like Will Eisner's work on The Spirit, the EC editions that IDW has put out, and now some of those editions of early Marvel stuff, there's just no way to see that artwork with the same precision as to see it in that format, since the publishing standards in the time when that work was actually appearing were much less and much less sophisticated than they are today.
So yeah, there you go. This is the stuff that both Mike and I have been reading and we're looking forward to in the weeks to come. We're sorry that the customers weren't here to take part in the conversation, but that's fine because one of the things about having a co-host on these on-location shows,
we get along very fine by ourselves. We don't need anybody else.
Exactly.
We don't need anybody.
Exactly.
That's not true, of course.
But again, we will be back in a couple of weeks.
Please, we need you.
July 18th at 6 o'clock. So if you're in the area, they're located at 417 Pecan Avenue. Heroes aren't hard to find. So come in and talk with us then. But before that, definitely get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our on-location shows. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe, or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your telephone or your mobile phone and calling 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're two guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can contact us individually. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com, and Mike?
At comicsalternative.com.
That's right. Mike at comicsalternative.com. Or Michael at
Comics Alternative. They'd say it's my secret identity. So,
yeah. You can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, on location and otherwise, as well as the various reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which, again, is comicsalternative.com. Mike?
Well, happy 4th of July, everyone, as I'm looking around the shop now and seeing the beautiful reproductions of old comics covers. My eye is drawn. You can see these. They're above the racks here at Heroes. It's great to look at. And my eye is drawn to one of the 1950s Captain America featuring Captain America Commie Smasher. We need him today. Break up that summit with Putin, Cap. We need you.
That's right, yeah. And on that thought, we will be back in a couple of weeks. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Michael.
Take care.